Hi again. How are you? I hope things are going well. I am happy to show you a little bit more about social theory today, and we've got two theorists in this chapter that are beginning to introduce a different kind of logic, you could say, to sociological theory. The way that your author of the textbook, Kenneth Allen, discusses them is to say that they're really important for American sociology and the development of sociology in the 1900s. And this is true. The first one that we're going to talk about in this chapter, Talcott Parsons, was really, some people think of as a key figure in this movement called structural functionalism. And that's located there. I just made the dot on your slide. A way of kind of understanding society as like an organism. It's going back to an earlier set of slides we looked at on Herbert Spencer and the idea of how structures function and work together. Parsons is not discussed so much today or referenced so much today, but Kenneth Allen notes that he is crucial in terms of influencing other people and the thoughts and responses to him. So it's worth talking about him perhaps for a few slides and his life in the context of his thinking. Talcott Parsons, it says there, lived pretty much 77 years from the very early part of 1900, 1902 into 1979. He was born in Colorado Springs, Colorado, not very far from Kearney, Nebraska, and studied at Amherst and then also at the London School of Economics. His PhD ultimately came from the University of Heidelberg in Germany. He was a member of the faculty at Harvard for several decades. Now, he did not really have a place in a sociology department. What he did was he created an interdisciplinary department of social relations at Harvard. And so this has been sort of a unique thing that this premier sociologist really created his own kind of department and or discipline, if you will, trying to bring together many disciplines to study, as he says, social relations, the links between various forms of social science. In 1937, he published this work, The Structure of Social Action, which was introducing a lot of European thinkers to American sociologists, and for that alone is very well known. As I said before, he's well known for the shepherding in of this structural functionalist movement, and then died in 1979. Action theory is something that they're discussing here in your text, that there's a basic distinction in sociology and in some disciplines about what's called structure versus action. And the idea is that there are individuals, and individuals always work within a structure. So there's this notion of structure and also agency. Agency is your ability to act. You cannot act, really, without there being some kind of structure in place. One thing I like to think of with this is, for example, you are going to play the blues. The blues has a certain kind of structure already designated that make it the blues. Certain kinds of chords, for example, are used in blues songs. And what then happens is the individual has agency within that structure to create something that's more individualistic and speaks to them. So you'll have Stevie Ray Vaughan play the blues, very different from, say, Eric Clapton. But the structure allows for the individual action and the agency. And so there's always a relationship between the two. Parsons, when he talked about action theory, he wanted to look at the action rather than the structure. And his idea that he developed, voluntaristic action theory, which is you as an individual are voluntarily acting under influences from your environment. So this also gets at another key set of ideas within our discipline. Do you have free will? Do you have choice in how you act? And to what extent are your actions, thoughts, behaviors, whole being in some ways determined by your environment? And the debate here is called the free will versus determinism debate. How much of who you are is really who you are organically from you? How much of who you are is really an effect of your environment, the influences of others around you? So this idea of action theory, you voluntarily act under influences from your environment, tries to bring a sort of a middle ground between these two possible extreme poles. And he creates this idea called the unit act. And this is an analytical model that has this one component that he's developing. And every act entails two essential ingredients: an agent and a set of goals toward which the action is directed. So the unit act, as I have written, involves an actor, an individual, and a set of goals. You cannot choose the conditions under which you act, right? Those are set for you. You can't choose the historical era you're born into, for example. But you can choose how you act within the structure and the conditions that you're facing. Parsons also very smartly suggests that into every social interaction you bring two things: motivations and values. And you may think, well, why is that important? Why does that matter? You could make a case again that this is what makes humans unique as a species. Animals, for example, don't have values. They act often in terms of instinct. And so what makes humans a different kind of species and having a different cognition that can be studied are things like considering how people have motivations and values, and they bring those into every social interaction. He said that all social interaction can be understood as some type of, in terms of the relationship between the means and the ends. Now, what is means and ends? What is that discussion about? The means are how you do things, and the end is really the goal that you want to achieve. So let's say, for example, you want to get a degree at this university. You could be an upright, honest student and go through the material and study and do well and get through the university, or you could cheat and plagiarize and be very poor in terms of your behavior and your ethics, and that might also get you the same result. So the funny thing is he's talking about social action and the relationship between means and ends, and says our values indicate what kind of behavior that we expect from other people and how we judge those behaviors. So humans, again, are trying to accomplish certain tasks, and we, as human beings, judge others based on the values we hold and the way in which we see them achieving the things they achieve. Parsons also said that humans are tied together through what he called meaningful issues. And again, humans are different from other species because we have symbols that we give meaning to. We assign meaning to symbols. And so we are tied together as units because of these meaningful issues for Parsons. He talked about three different types of values that humans hold: cognitive, appreciative, and moral. Now let's think about this. Cognitive means thinking, okay? So they're related to thought. Appreciative means, you could say, more sort of aesthetic, how you like something. Moral is related to questions of right and wrong. And so he said we have these three different types of values that we have, which you can apply to different things. Um, you don't judge Shakespeare, for example, through moral values. You judge Shakespeare through aesthetic values. Um, and so he said we have these kinds of values, and they correspond with particular actions. The cognitive lines up with strategic action. The appreciative values that we have line up with expressive action, and the moral values line up with moral action. And so there is a nice figure in your textbook where it goes through these types of action and the way that they connect with the values. So there's a relationship that Parsons is trying to tease out. And so in some ways this theoretical work he's doing is very, very, he's trying to explain a whole lot through these kinds of ideas. And you can see that in some ways it's useful, and perhaps in other ways maybe not so much, which is why maybe Parsons isn't as quoted today. He is thought of as, you could say, a grand theorist. He's trying to theorize a great deal of stuff and explain a lot through his theories. Here is something else we can talk about. If I, for example, want to engage in like strategic instrumental action, then what I'll do is seek out other people who want the same thing out of interaction. If I want to accomplish something, I'll seek out other people who are similarly oriented and want to also accomplish probably that same thing. And then what's going to happen is we're going to form a system of status positions, norms, and roles. So a great example would be the educational system at UNK. If we individuals say we want to provide a secondary education for people in the Nebraska and general area, and we want to do this, we feel that's important, we want to promote this education. So if I wanted to do that, I would seek out others who would help facilitate that, and then create an institution which would be a system of status positions like professors, administrators, registrars, all the positions we have, norms, how we are supposed to behave and conduct ourselves, and the behavior and conduct we expect from students, and roles. The positions link up to certain kinds of behaviors that we're expecting from each other. And that is the process of institutionalization. We create these institutions to meet human needs. And different institutions meet all kinds of different needs. Religious institutions, financial institutions, the economy, the educational institution. So you see how these are connected. And this final part of the slide here, institutions then in some very simple way are just sets of norms, roles, statuses, and value patterns designed to meet some kind of social need. So, for example, when you think about the dollar bill that you have in your wallet, it's part of this economic institution, and it's designed to meet the needs of how to transfer products, goods, and services from one person to another. There's a whole system in place there that's useful to facilitate meeting that need, and that's the institution. You can also consider Parsons in relation to previous theorists such as Durkheim. And Kenneth Allen does this. He talks about how Durkheim argued that institutions involve a collective consciousness that creates a moral force, that people coming together get this kind of collective notion that allows for people to feel that they ought to behave in one way or another. Parsons says that there are different institutions and that they act in a better way when they present some clearly known and expected ways of doing things. So he is arguing, in a sense, that this creates something along the lines of a Freudian internalization of values and meanings. So there's a slight difference that Kenneth Allen is noting between Durkheim and Parsons. Parsons is very well known for this paradigm, which is generally called the AGIL paradigm, and it's his way of explaining how systems interrelate. Part of the argument is he's saying all systems have the same needs, so we can create one kind of paradigm to understand all systems. And this is his. He says that systems want to maintain some kind of equilibrium, and in order to do that, there are 4 different things they have to produce. First, adaptation, and that's the A part of the AGIL. Okay, adaptation to an environment. Adaptation means adapting resources and converting those resources into usable elements. The second part of the paradigm, attainment of its goals. Okay, so that's the G aspect of AGIL. Attainment of its goals. Systems have to somehow attain the goals that they're designed to complete. And that's something, again, all systems have as a common denominator, and something that Parsons points out. Third, all systems have the I, or integration of components. See if I can get you an example of this. In other words, they need to form, coordinate, and blend into a functioning or a unified whole. So they unite with something else and incorporate into a larger unit. So different parts work together and are integrated. You don't have a system, for example, University of Nebraska at Kearney, where there are parts that don't work with other parts. The registrar system works with, for example, campus security, which works with, for example, professors as a part of the entire university. And then the 4th component of the AGIL paradigm is the maintaining of latent pattern, a cultural template. And so this is explained here. It's often called latent pattern maintenance. Not everything that happens in our body is directed through cognitive function, says Allen, but rather some of those functions, like breathing, are just managed and maintained through an automatic nervous system. So it would be too costly to make people conform to social expectations through government and law. What we need to do is to create sort of a latent pattern maintenance through the development of cultural templates like norms and folkways. And that's what that part of the paradigm is about. Parsons says these together are all part of a system's functional imperatives. They're all, and imperative means absolutely essential, right? All systems have to have these 4 aspects. And the final part of Kenneth Allen's discussion on Parsons is this idea of a cybernetic hierarchy of control. Hierarchy means an order, of course, and this cybernetic hierarchy is the social system is a subsystem that exists within an environment of all kinds of systems. So again, Parsons is a grand theorist. He's trying to think in very abstract ways about systems and how they work together. So he's saying that the social system is a subsystem that also involves the cultural system, personality systems, organic systems. So if you want to think of it this way, Parsons tried to explain a whole lot of things through very general ideas, and to some extent that aim that he had is also part of why perhaps he's not used very often these days, because you have to say, well, if an explanation tries to cover everything, does it cover anything really well? And so this is the critique, in some ways, of Talcott Parsons' work. Parsons thought that the relations among all those different subsystems can then be analyzed through his AGIL relations paradigm. And he tried to show again some of the structural conditions of these systems. He said that you can have an organic system which has energy that flows up and a control that flows down from culture systems. So this idea with the cybernetic hierarchy of control is energy comes up from the bottom, and also control comes down from the top. And so these two things sort of come together in the middle for those people who are between those extremes. The generalized media of exchange is his idea of how structures within a system talk to one another. This maintains equilibrium or balance. And as an example of that, you've got, say, different structures in our society have distinct goals, values, norms, but the capitalist economy, with its goal of producing profit, the educational system has a goal of producing critical thinking. They have to somehow be able to work within each other. And so there's a generalized medium of exchange language, for example, that helps maintain some forms of equilibrium or balance so that they can work in relative harmony and communicate. Finally, even though this wasn't a big part of trying to understand why parts work together, you do have strain in systems and sometimes revolution. Revolution means that the system isn't working in some ways and gets overthrown and replaced with another system. He says that equilibrium is a system ideal, right? So like your body maintains a relatively set temperature, and when it falls outside of that range, you have trouble. So equilibrium is the ideal. And some groups, though, might try to hold on to a dysfunctional way of doing things when it's obvious that they are no longer working in a system. They're dysfunctional for that system. So he's saying when parts of a system change, but then other parts refuse to change, a revolution can be explained, and that's a subculture that starts to promote its norms and values as legitimate. So in some ways you see the paradigm here trying to deal with what you could call anomalies, right? What Thomas Kuhn would call anomalies, things that don't quite work in the explanation that he's offering, which is that systems ideally should all sort of have their parts that work together in harmony. How do you explain it when they don't? And that's part of the challenge that you see toward the end of Kenneth Allen's explanation of Talcott Parsons. Robert K. Merton is the next theorist who studied under Talcott Parsons, and here you'll begin to see the effect of Parsons' thought on Merton, and how Merton in some ways is critiquing some of Parsons' ideas. So again, it's lovely, I think, to understand theorists in relation to each other, to see the evolution of ideas. So who was Merton? He lived a very long life. Born in Philadelphia, his parents were Jewish immigrants from Europe, and he studied, as I said a second ago, under Parsons, but also Pittram Sorokin, who's also a very well-known sociologist, and Paul Lazarsfeld. He received his PhD from Harvard. Again, that's where Talcott Parsons was for decades. And Merton is known for having coined terms that are so ubiquitous today. It's kind of amazing to think that sociologists came up with some of these. He, for example, coined the term self-fulfilling prophecy. How many times have you heard that in your life? It's a stunner that your discipline that you're studying here is directly related to verbiage that gets tossed around in an everyday way. The idea of a role model, right? Everyone knows this concept. Manifest and latent functions. Sometimes people are more or less familiar with those. We'll talk about that. But he also talked about this lovely, lovely idea of unintended consequences. We'll discuss it. Parsons, the fellow we just discussed, was into grand theories. Merton is into what are called middle range theories. So, middle range theories are more humble and less abstract than grand theories. If a grand theory is very abstract and trying to explain a lot of stuff, and a micro theory is just explaining a little bit of stuff and is very context oriented, a middle range theory is going to explain between a larger and a very, very specific explanation. So his idea, Merton's idea, is that you can have hypotheses that are supposed to be confirmed empirically. You test your theory to see whether or not it's true, and that these middle range theories should be generalized and be able to be applied to different situations. So in a sense, this is critical of Parsons, which is very, very general and vague. And it speaks to the different forms of logic that each man preferred. For Parsons, his approach tends to be deductive logic. Deductive logic means you begin with a theory and then you move down to observations. And it's rooted in reason. There is a common syllogism, or it's a kind of a logical language structure that's associated with deductive logic. I know you've heard this. The first part of this syllogism is all men are mortal. Okay, so there's the theory. All men are mortal. There's the general view. Caesar is a man. So here's the general view. All men are mortal. Caesar is a man. That's the specific case. Therefore, Caesar is mortal. You see how you take the general theory, you apply it to a specific case, and you come up with your logic. So that's rooted in reasoning. Merton's view was favoring inductive logic. So again, if you're following me, deductive logic, you start with theory, you move to observations. Inductive logic, if it helps to draw it out, you start with observations and you move toward developing theory. So begin with observations and then you move to generating theory from those. And that's not rooted in empiricism, that's not rooted in reason, it's rooted more in empiricism. So here's an inductive syllogism. You start with observations. This swan is white. That swan is white. That swan is white. That swan is white. You're doing observations, okay? Therefore, it seems that most swans are white. So that's the idea of how you come up with the reality of situations. Your statement is, this swan is white, that swan is white, that swan is white. Therefore, probably most swans are white. So each man has his own kind of logic associated with the development of his theory. Merton took Parsons to task for functionalism and had critiques of structural functionalism, and there are three of them we can talk about. Again, I mentioned this a long time ago, but Thomas Kuhn talked about structure of scientific revolution and the development of paradigms. Functionalism became a paradigm, a way of organizing information and thinking about certain society in a particular way. Each paradigm allows you to ask some questions and not ask others. So Merton is starting to deconstruct this way of thinking, and he does it by raising the following questions. He asks this question: do all societies have a functional unity? Do all of the parts work together in some respects to make a whole? Are all the social activities and cultural items across society functionally related? Is that true? So that's his first critique. Second critique is this notion of universal functionalism. And this is the idea that all social institutions have positive social function. Again, he asks, is that true? Do all social institutions have a positive function, something that works for the whole good of society and that keeps society going? The third critique he makes is this notion of indispensability. He argues that, is it true that every part of society and culture fulfills a vital function and is indispensable? Is that true? And if that is true, then why do some aspects of society seem to stop and wither away, or die, if you want to use an analogy of the body? And that's what he's doing, as I just said a minute ago. He's presenting what Thomas Kuhn would call the anomalies of functionalism, the way functionalism fails to explain things about social life. So he creates the possibility, Merton does, of a paradigm shift, a move away from structural functionalism as a way of understanding society. He cleverly comes up with manifest functions versus latent functions. So in some ways, Merton is still struggling with functionalism and seeing if he can change the terms to make it work. Manifest functions, he says, are those that are intended. So let's ask you, just for example, can you think of some of the intended functions of college, of university? Perhaps you're thinking of things like passing on skills and knowledge from one group to another, one generation to another. That's the manifest function, the intended function of a university. The latent functions are unintended functions, things that an institution does that it may not mean to do or it's not intended to do. So what are some of the latent functions of university and a university education? Perhaps a latent function is it becomes a venue for you to meet a spouse. The university doesn't intend for you to come here to do that, but many people do find their spouse at the universities that they attend. It also teaches you, and I mean this in a very serious way, it teaches people how to, for example, party, right? You learn the norms and what's acceptable and not acceptable. And some people don't learn those things, and that's a problem. But for college, it gives people an idea of how they should behave in social functions, including partying in general terms. Right? Dysfunctions are when a social structure leads to less adaptation and integration. So dysfunctions are when things are not working for all the different parts to come together and make this whole that has equilibrium. There's a very lovely idea that Merton came up with, the notion of unanticipated consequences. And there's a lovely phrase that you can think of with this. I'm sure you've heard it. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. So have you ever done something for somebody where you had the best intentions, you wanted to help them out, and then you come to find that in fact what you did for them really screwed them up in the long run? Let's say, for example, you see someone who's poor and you give money to them. You think, oh, this is good. I'm doing this, something that's positive. And then you come to find maybe this person bought drugs with the money, and then maybe it ended up perhaps killing them. They overdose on the drugs. So there was this terrible, unanticipated consequence of your actions. So functionalism doesn't necessarily have an ability to conceptualize how our actions sometimes result in these terrible consequences or completely unanticipated consequences. Sometimes people can want to harm another person. So their idea is, I want to hurt you. But then the people who become hurt sometimes say, well, that was actually the best thing for me. I gained so much from that experience. So Merton's responsible for this notion. Merton also looked at deviance and ambivalence. And there's a funny issue here, that deviance, what counts as deviant, is related to some extent on having strong norms. And there's this question about how deviance can be related to ambivalence. If people don't really care about norms so much, if they're ambivalent, can you have deviance? So deviance isn't just about norms, but it's also about the extent to which people care or not about those norms. Merton is also well known for developing what has been called strain theory. And this is sometimes referred to as anomie theory. And I think the names are important. I'll talk with you about why those names are used sometimes interchangeably. But the notion behind the theory, we'll just start with that, is that crime is a direct result of frustration and anger that individuals feel when their ability to achieve a financial form or social form of success is blocked. So you can think about this, and I think it'll make sense to you. If you felt like you wanted to achieve something, you're told that's a good thing, but then you're not able to do it through social institutions or legitimate means, you're probably going to feel frustrated and angry. And that's the strain that is the name that's connected with Merton's theory. It's also called anomie theory because Merton modified the work of Emil Durkheim and his concept of anomie. You might remember Durkheim, and his idea of anomie was basically a state of normlessness. Okay? So the norms for Durkheim, when you have anomie, the norms are falling apart. We have, for example, a more secular culture today. And that means that religious norms that were really strong in the past don't hold as much. So that's Durkheim's idea of anomie. Merton says, he tweaks Durkheim to say that anomie for him is when accepted norms are in conflict with social reality. It's not that they're falling apart. It's that they're not possible to achieve in the social milieu that a person's in. Okay, so it's a very different way of thinking of anomie. The way that you can think about Merton's notion is we have certain goals that are promoted in, for example, the United States. And one of them, we often have this notion of the American dream, which most everybody's heard of. This is colloquial. A lot of people think of the American dream as being, oh, I want a house with a white picket fence, car, 2.3 kids. You know, nobody wants 0.3 kids. But the notion that you can achieve and succeed and own property and have a family as you want to have. And the thing about the American dream is it's American. The United States is seen as affording opportunity for its citizens in a way that no other country in the world does. Okay? My father came here from Germany, and he immigrated to the United States. The first job he had was shoveling snow off of the roof of the university buildings that I later went to. So in some ways, this is the American dream. America gives immigrants the chance to succeed and achieve based on hard work, and their kids can achieve and succeed. And so they're not stuck in a certain position or social class. So American is the place this happens. Dream, of course, also refers to like a dream, like a fantasy or a goal. Okay? So in America, the idea is anyone can attain wealth, prosperity, and prestige. But here's the question. Is that true? Can anyone attain wealth, prosperity, and prestige? Or is the playing field not quite level for different kinds of people? In another way of phrasing it, is the starting line different for you if you're in a minority group? Do women make the same rate of pay as men, for example? Are minority group members incarcerated at higher levels than other dominant group members? And so you begin to see, in fact, the American dream is not something everyone has an equal chance of getting, right? So the way I phrased it, economically disadvantaged people don't have the legitimate means to achieve the goal of the American dream. What does that mean? That means those people are going to feel frustrated. If you come from an inner city neighborhood where your school is terrible and you don't even have resources because the property taxes in that neighborhood don't pay for a decent school, and you have violence around you, and you don't have even nutritional food because it's all convenience stores and fast food joints, then you aren't able to achieve the American dream, and that's going to lead you to feel frustrated. If the social structure hinders you from achieving the cultural goals, then what Merton argues is you're going to have anomie, and sometimes that's going to be crime coming out of that frustration and anomie that you're experiencing. In this final slide on Merton, I'm going to show you his typology that he came up with for understanding how individuals adapt to a society and their modes of individual adaptation. Typology is a fancy word for classification scheme, a way of understanding types and organizing information. So what this is it's a 3-column chart. The mode of adaptation, this is the name that he gave to the way people work in their society, depending on their relationship to the cultural goal and their ability to get there, the means of achieving the goal. So I'll walk you through each of these. It's very, very likely that you sitting where you are a conformist, what Merton would call a conformist, because you probably believe in the cultural goal of the American dream. You believe that you can achieve based on your own merits, right? That's why you're in college. That's why you're taking this web course. And you believe in the institutional means to getting to the American dream. You say, I want the American dream, and I'm going to go through the legitimate means, institutional means of getting there. So that's why you are a conformist. There are 2 pluses on this part of the column here. Innovators were people that Merton found believed in the American dream too, right? There's a plus sign, a positive sign. But they didn't either have access to or really, the ability to go through institutionalized means of getting there. So he said, and this is important, take note of it, innovation is the mode of adaptation that's most associated with crime and criminal behavior. So a lot of criminals, like take for example people who deal crack, they actually, strangely enough, believe in the American dream. They want the autonomy of being able to succeed based on hard work. If they deal more drugs, they get more profit. They don't want to wear a stupid uniform. They want to be able to rise up within an organization and do well and have material success and a happy family life. So actually, criminals are in some ways just like everyone else, in that they believe in, generally speaking, the cultural goal. And the difference is they don't think they can go through college to get there. They don't think they can go through legitimate institutionalized means to achieve the American dream. The other three are probably easier to understand now. Ritualism is if you don't really think that you can achieve the American dream. Most people, they don't believe the American dream is possible for them anymore. They say, well, you know, the days of owning a property or having a family of whatever size you want are gone. But some of those people, they keep going through the motions, right? They show up for school or work, they dress well, etc. Those were people Merton called ritualists. Retreatists, I like to think of as maybe people who like do drugs, for example. So they don't really believe in the American dream, and they don't really engage in the institutional means of achieving it. They're just retreating off into, say, for example, again, drug use. Rebellion is mixing and matching the goals, the cultural goals, and the institutionalized means. So people sometimes in the 1950s and 60s, when Merton was writing and developing stuff, they were rebels. They would take parts of the American dream and reject other parts. They would take some institutional means and reject others. Final ideas of Merton to think about. Sociological ambivalence. Opposing normative tendencies in a social role. Now, what does that mean? A lot of $10 words there. Basically, it means that the roles that we embody these days have a lot of ambivalence, and that's in part a relationship to our social structure. I'll give you examples. You probably have professors who embody the role of a professor in a very different way than I do. And you might think about that and say, well, I guess that's true. You know, my econ professor or my health sciences professor or whoever has a very different personality and way of doing things, way of running a class, even a web-based class, than this person. That is sociological ambivalence, that we have roles, but how you're supposed to embody those roles in relation to a particular status is more and more ambiguous and not set in concrete or stone. This is the same for medical doctors today. In the past, the doctor was very much the authority. Now, through advertising for things like pharmaceuticals, you might come into your doctor's office saying, well, I was told by this ad, ask my doctor about Prozac or something. And your doctor then says, well, okay, maybe you could use this drug. So this idea of who is the more powerful person in the arrangement, doctors now are in the position of not just informing people of their options, but actively consulting with people and thinking through other options that they may have come up with on their own. So there's a lot of ambivalence in roles today, in power positions. More police officers in some respects are acting like social workers, for example. So these are the examples I have here, and I think it's fascinating to think about how you individually are going to play some kind of role because you're going to embody a status. The way you're going to do that has a lot to do with your personality and the social structure and the elasticity of it to allow you to do the things you need to do in the way you're going to do them.